The morning mist clung to the hills of Anatolia like a shroud as 10-year-old Dmitri clutched his mother's hand, unaware that this would be their final embrace. The year was 1453, and the Ottoman Empire's most fearsome tradition was about to claim another generation of Christian boys for its ranks. Sultan Mehmed II had perfected what his predecessors had begun. The Devshirme system, a calculated harvest of human potential that would transform conquered Christian children into the empire's most elite fighting force. The Janissaries, whose name derived from Yenikeri meaning new troops, represented the Sultan's personal guard and the backbone of Ottoman military might. As the Ottoman officials moved through the village, their trained eyes assessed each boy between the ages of 8 and 18. They sought specific qualities: intelligence, physical strength, and the malleability of youth. Dmitri, with his sharp green eyes and sturdy frame, caught their attention immediately. His father, a Serbian blacksmith, had taught him to read and write, skills that would serve him well in his new life, though he did not yet understand this cruel providence. The selection process was methodical and merciless. Boys were examined like livestock, their teeth checked, their reflexes tested, their parentage verified. Only the finest specimens would join the ranks of the Janissaries, while others might serve in the palace administration or as skilled craftsmen. The Ottomans had learned that investing in quality rather than quantity produced superior results. Dmitri's mother wept silently as the officials marked her son for collection. She knew, as all Christian mothers in the conquered territories knew, that resistance was futile. The Devshirme was not merely a tax on their communities. It was a transformation that would turn their children into instruments of Ottoman expansion. Yet there was a bitter irony in this system. Many of these boys would rise to positions of power and influence that would have been impossible in their birth communities. The journey to Constantinople began at dawn. Dmitri found himself among 300 other boys, all torn from their families, all facing an uncertain future. The older boys tried to comfort the younger ones, but fear and homesickness permeated the group like a contagion. They walked for days, their feet bleeding, their spirits broken. Yet something else was beginning to emerge among them, a bond forged in shared adversity. As they approached the capital, the great dome of Hagia Sophia rose before them like a monument to their new destiny. The city bustled with activity, merchants from across the known world, scholars debating philosophy, and everywhere the presence of the Janissaries themselves, resplendent in their white felt caps and blue uniforms. These elite soldiers moved with a confidence that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. The boys were processed through the palace complex with military precision. They were bathed, clothed in simple garments, and assigned to different training centers based on their assessed potential. Dmitri, along with the most promising candidates, was sent to the Enderun school within the Topkapi Palace, where he would receive an education that rivaled any in Europe. The transformation had begun. Within these walls, Christian boys would learn Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. They would study mathematics, theology, and military strategy. Most importantly, they would convert to Islam and adopt new names, new identities, and new loyalties. Dmitri would become Hazen, a name that would one day strike fear into the hearts of European armies. The first year at the Enderun school tested every fiber of young Hazen's being. The boy who had once been Dmitri found himself in a world where survival depended on adaptation, where clinging to the past meant certain failure. The Ottoman training system was designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it in service to the Sultan and Allah. Each dawn brought the call to prayer, and Hazen learned to kneel facing Mecca alongside his fellow recruits. The religious instruction was intensive and uncomfortable. Islamic scholars taught them the Quran, the Hadith, and the principles of Islamic law. For many boys, this represented the most profound transformation, not just changing their names or language, but fundamentally altering their understanding of God and their place in the world. Physical training began before sunrise and continued past sunset. The boys learned to march in perfect formation, to handle yatagan swords with deadly precision, and to fire the newly introduced muskets that were giving the Ottomans a decisive advantage over their enemies. The training was brutal, designed to forge bodies capable of enduring the rigors of campaign and the violence of battle. Hazen excelled in these disciplines, his blacksmith father's strength evident in his broad shoulders and steady hands. But it was his intellect that truly set him apart. He mastered Turkish faster than most, showed an aptitude for mathematics that impressed his instructors, and demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that marked future commanders. The psychological conditioning was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of their training. The boys were taught that their previous lives had been a form of ignorance, that their conversion to Islam had saved their souls, and that their service to the Sultan was the highest form of devotion. They were shown the wealth and power that awaited those who served faithfully, and the terrible consequences that befell those who betrayed their oath. According to historical accounts preserved in the Ottoman state archives, the training regimen was so comprehensive that it produced soldiers who were not only physically superior but also deeply loyal to the empire. The Janissaries became known throughout Europe as the most disciplined and effective fighting force of their era, their reputation preceding them into battle like a psychological weapon. Competition among the trainees was fierce but carefully managed. The instructors understood that rivalry could drive excellence, but that excessive competition could undermine the unity essential to military effectiveness. Hazen found himself both competing with and protecting his fellow recruits, learning the delicate balance between individual ambition and collective loyalty. The boys were also exposed to the broader world of Ottoman culture. They learned about the empire's history, its conquests, and its destiny. They were taught that they were part of something greater than themselves, a force that was spreading the true faith across the world and bringing civilization to the ignorant. This sense of purpose became as important as any weapon in their arsenal. By his second year, Hazen had begun to think in Turkish more than Serbian. His memories of his mother's face grew dimmer, replaced by the stern visage of his military instructors and the presence of successful Janissary commanders who visited the school. The transformation was working exactly as designed. The final phase of basic training involved exposure to actual combat. The boys were taken on campaigns as observers and support personnel, allowing them to witness the reality of war without being thrown into its full fury. Hazen watched his first battle from a hilltop overlooking the Danube, where Ottoman forces were suppressing a Hungarian rebellion, the sight of Janissary units moving in perfect coordination. Their volleys of musket fire, devastating enemy formations, filled him with pride and anticipation. The year was 1680, and 20-year-old Hazen stood among the elite Janissary corps as they gazed upon the walls of Vienna. 30 years of training had transformed the Serbian blacksmith's son into a formidable warrior, his muscled frame bearing the scars of countless skirmishes, and his eyes reflecting the cold calculation of a professional soldier. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha had declared that this siege would be the final stroke that would bring all of Europe under Ottoman dominion. The massive Ottoman army, numbering over 100,000 men, had swept through Hungary like a tide of conquest. Christian villages had fallen one after another, their populations either fled or absorbed into the Ottoman war machine. Now, as the crescent banners fluttered in the Austrian wind, Vienna represented the last major obstacle between the Sultan's forces and the heart of Christian Europe. Hazen commanded a company of 200 veterans who had served from the Crimean steppes to the deserts of Yemen. These were not the untested boys he had once trained alongside, but hardened warriors who had proven themselves in dozens of campaigns. They respected him not because of his origins. Few even remembered that he had once been a Christian, but because of his tactical brilliance and his unwavering commitment to victory. The siege began with the traditional Ottoman precision. Engineers, many of them former Christian slaves like Hazen, directed the construction of massive earthworks and artillery positions. The famous Ottoman cannons, some weighing over 15 tons, were dragged into position to pound the city's medieval walls. The sound of their bombardment echoed across the Danube Valley like thunder, a constant reminder to the defenders that their doom was approaching. For 2 months, the siege continued with relentless intensity. Hazen's Janissaries were assigned to the most dangerous tasks, leading assaults on the breached walls, conducting nighttime raids against Austrian positions, and maintaining the discipline that kept the massive army from dissolving into chaos. The young commander proved himself time and again, his men following him into situations that would have broken lesser units. The defenders of Vienna, led by Count Ernst, fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant not just death, but the end of their civilization. They had witnessed what happened to cities that resisted Ottoman conquest. Belgrade and dozens of others had been reduced to rubble, their populations enslaved or massacred. Vienna would not suffer the same fate without a fight. As the siege wore on, Hazen began to notice troubling signs within the Ottoman camp. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha had grown increasingly erratic, making decisions based more on personal ambition than military necessity. Supply lines were stretched thin, and disease was beginning to take its toll on the massive army. The Janissaries, accustomed to swift victories, were growing restless with the prolonged siege. The turning point came on September 11th, when scouts reported a massive relief army approaching from the west. King John III Sobieski of Poland had arrived with 18,000 Polish troops, joined by Austrian and Holy Roman Empire forces under Charles V, Duke of Lorraine. The combined Christian army numbered nearly 70,000 men, and they were advancing with the fury of a crusade. Hazen received his orders at dawn on September 12th. His Janissaries would hold the Ottoman left flank against the anticipated Polish assault, while the main army prepared to crush the relief force between the siege lines and the city walls. It was a sound strategy, but it required the kind of disciplined execution that had made the Janissaries legendary. The Battle of Vienna began with the largest cavalry charge in European history. Sobieski's Polish-winged hussars, their distinctive feathered lances glinting in the morning sun, thundered down the slopes of the Kollenberg heights like an avalanche of steel and horseflesh. The sight was terrifying even to experienced warriors like Hazen, who had never faced anything quite like this concentrated fury. The Ottoman lines held initially, the Janissaries' musket volleys and disciplined formations absorbing the first shock of the charge. But the momentum was with the Christians, and soon the entire Ottoman army was in retreat. Hazen fought a desperate rearguard action, his men covering the withdrawal of the main force while facing overwhelming odds. The withdrawal from Vienna became a nightmare of confusion and recrimination. The once mighty Ottoman army, which had seemed destined to conquer all of Europe, now streamed southward in disarray. Hazen's Janissaries maintained their discipline even in defeat, but around them, the fabric of Ottoman military organization was unraveling like a tapestry pulled apart by desperate hands. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha rode at the head of the retreat, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. He had promised Sultan Mehmed IV that Vienna would fall before the autumn rains, and now he faced the prospect of explaining how the greatest Ottoman army ever assembled had been routed by a coalition of Christian forces. The political ramifications would be severe, and heads would roll. Perhaps literally. For Hazen, the retreat provided an opportunity for reflection that had been absent during the intensity of the siege. As he led his men through the Hungarian countryside, protecting supply trains and maintaining order among the demoralized troops, he found himself thinking about the nature of the empire he served. The Ottoman system had taken him from his Serbian village and transformed him into a warrior, but it had also given him purpose, education, and a path to advancement. That would have been impossible in his birth community. The Janissaries around him represented the full spectrum of the empire's style. His lieutenant, Yusuf, had been born a Greek boy on the island of Crete. His sergeant, Osman, had been taken from a Bulgarian village much like Hazen's own. They spoke Turkish, thought in Turkish, and dreamed in Turkish, but their origins remained part of who they were, even if buried beneath layers of conditioning and conversion. As they established camp each night, Hazen noticed how his men maintained their rituals and discipline despite the chaos around them. They performed their prayers with the same precision they brought to military maneuvers, their faith providing stability in an uncertain world. The Islamic principles they had learned were not merely religious doctrine but a foundation for their entire worldview. Historical records from the Ottoman state archives, as documented by Turkish historian Hela, reveal that the retreat from Vienna marked a turning point in Janissary morale and effectiveness. The elite corps had suffered its first major defeat in generations, and the psychological impact was profound. Many questioned whether the empire's expansion had reached its natural limits, or whether internal corruption had weakened the system from within. The journey back to Constantinople took 3 months, during which time news arrived that shocked even the most hardened veterans. Sultan Mehmed IV had ordered the execution of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, holding him personally responsible for the disaster at Vienna. The head of the man who had led them into battle was displayed on the gates of the Topkapi Palace, a grim reminder of the price of failure in the Ottoman system. This news deeply affected Hazen and his men. They had followed Kara Mustafa's orders with absolute loyalty, believing in his vision of Ottoman destiny. Now they were forced to confront the possibility that their leaders were fallible, that the system they served was not the perfect instrument of divine will they had been taught to believe. The retreat also exposed them to the changing nature of European warfare. The Christian coalition that had defeated them at Vienna was not the disorganized feudal levy they had expected, but a modern military force equipped with advanced artillery and employing sophisticated tactics. The Polish cavalry charge had been devastating, but it was the coordinated infantry assault that had ultimately broken the Ottoman lines. As they approached the Ottoman heartland, Hazen began to see signs of the empire's internal struggles. Provincial governors were in open revolt, taxation was crushing rural communities, and the traditional Ottoman meritocracy was giving way to corruption and nepotism. The Devshirme system itself was under attack from Turkish noble families, who wanted their own sons to have access to positions of power. The Janissaries were no longer the innovative military force they had once been. Their resistance to new technologies and tactics had begun to show on the battlefield. While European armies were adopting new weapons and formations, the Janissaries clung to traditions that had served them well in previous centuries, but were becoming obsolete in the face of military evil. Upon reaching Constantinople, Hazen was summoned to the palace for debriefing. The new Grand Vizier, Fazel Mustafa Pasha, was determined to learn from the Vienna disaster and implement reforms that would restore Ottoman military supremacy. The conversations that followed would shape the next phase of Hazen's career and force him to confront fundamental questions about loyalty, tradition, and adaptation. 10 years had passed since the disaster of Vienna, and Hazen found himself in an unexpected position. Now 30 years old and bearing the rank of Janissary, he commanded not just a company but an entire regiment of the Sultan's elite troops. The scars of Vienna had healed on his body, but the questions raised by that defeat continued to trouble his mind. As he stood in the council chambers of the Topkapi Palace, Sultan Mustafa II had ascended to the throne with promises of reform and renewal. The empire was no longer the expanding force it had been in the days of Suleiman the Magnificent, but was instead fighting to maintain its existing territories against increasingly aggressive European coalitions. The Holy League, formed in the aftermath of Vienna, had pushed Ottoman forces back across the Danube and was threatening to reconquer Hungary entirely. The new Grand Vizier, Elmas Mashmi Pasha, had summoned the senior Janissary commanders to discuss fundamental changes to the corps structure and training. The old ways, he argued, were no longer sufficient to meet the challenges facing the empire. European military technology had advanced dramatically, and the Janissaries' traditional tactics were proving inadequate against modern warfare. Hazen listened as younger officers argued for immediate adoption of European innovations. They wanted to abandon the traditional yataghan swords in favor of bayonets, to restructure the corps along European regimental lines, and to eliminate many of the religious and cultural practices that had defined Janissary identity for centuries. Their arguments were logical and supported by battlefield experience, but they struck at the heart of what made the Janissaries unique. The older commanders, many of whom had served since before Vienna, resisted these changes with fierce determination. They argued that the Janissaries' strength lay not in their weapons but in their discipline, their loyalty, and their unshakable faith. To abandon these traditions would be to destroy the very foundation of their effectiveness. They pointed to recent victories in the Caucasus and Crimea as evidence that the old ways still had merit. Hazen found himself caught between these opposing viewpoints. His education at the Enderun school had taught him to think strategically and to adapt to changing circumstances. He had seen firsthand how European military innovations had contributed to the defeat at Vienna. Yet he also understood that the Janissaries' effectiveness came from something deeper than mere technology. It came from their shared identity and their absolute commitment to the Sultan's cause. The debate was complicated by the changing nature of recruitment. The Devshirme system was no longer producing the same quality of recruits it had in previous centuries. Christian communities had learned to hide their most promising sons, and the Ottoman administration had become corrupt enough that bribes could sometimes secure exemptions. Increasingly, the Janissaries were being recruited from Muslim Turkish families, changing the fundamental character of the corps. According to scholarly research published in the Journal of Ottoman Studies, this transformation of the Janissary recruitment system had profound implications for military effectiveness and political stability. The traditional meritocracy that had elevated men like Hazen based on ability rather than birth was giving way to a more conventional system that favored connections and wealth over. Hazen proposed a compromise that would preserve the essential character of the Janissaries, while adapting to new military realities. He suggested creating specialized units within the corps that would focus on new technologies and tactics, while maintaining the traditional formations for situations where their unique capabilities would be most effective. This approach would allow for experimentation without abandoning the traditions that had made the Janissaries legendary. The proposal was met with skepticism from both sides. The reformers considered it too conservative, while the traditionalists saw it as the beginning of the end for Janissary identity. But Grand Vizier Elmas Mehmed Pasha saw merit in the idea and authorized Hazen to create a pilot program with 500 selected men. The experiment began in 1694 as Ottoman forces prepared for a new campaign against the Holy League. Hazen's hybrid unit combined traditional Janissary discipline with modern European tactics and weapons. They trained with muskets equipped with bayonets, practiced complex maneuvers, and studied the latest developments in artillery and fortification. The test came during the Battle of Zenta where Prince Eugene of Savoy led an Austrian army against Ottoman forces attempting to cross the Tisa River. The battle would prove to be another disaster for Ottoman arms, but it would also demonstrate both the potential and the limitations of Hazen's reform efforts. As the Ottoman army attempted to establish a bridgehead across the river, Austrian forces launched a coordinated assault that caught the Turks in a vulnerable position. Hazen's reformed Janissaries performed admirably, their disciplined volleys and tactical flexibility allowing them to hold their positions longer than other units. But they were ultimately overwhelmed by the superior numbers and positioning of the Austrian forces. The defeat at Zenta was even more catastrophic than Vienna had been. The Ottoman army was virtually annihilated, with casualties exceeding 20,000 men. Sultan Mustafa II himself barely escaped capture, and the empire was forced to sue for peace on terms that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The Treaty of Karlowitz, signed in 1699, marked the end of an era for the Ottoman Empire and for men like Hazen who had devoted their lives to its expansion. For the first time in its history, the empire was forced to cede significant territory to European powers, acknowledging that the age of Ottoman conquest was over. Hungary, Transylvania, and most of the Balkans passed into Austrian hands, while Venice regained control of the Morea and parts of Dalmatia. Hazen, now 46 years old and bearing the honorary title of Pasha, found himself administering the remnants of Ottoman Europe from a fortress overlooking the Danube, the river that had once been a highway for Ottoman. Expansion now marked the boundary between the empire and its Christian enemies. His hair had turned gray beneath his white felt cap, and his body bore the accumulated wounds of countless campaigns, but his mind remained sharp and his loyalty unwavering. The reforms he had championed were finally being implemented across the Janissary corps, but they came too late to prevent the empire's decline. The new Sultan Ahmed III was more interested in art and poetry than military conquest, and the empire was entering a period that historians would later call the Tulip period, a time of cultural flowering but military stagnation. The men under Hasan's command represented the final generation of traditional Janissary. They had been recruited through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, and trained in the ancient traditions of the corps. but they were also the last of their kind. The system that had created them was being dismantled, replaced by conventional recruitment methods that failed to produce the same quality of soldier. His lieutenant, Yusuf, had served with him for 20 years and had become like a brother. They often talked about the old days, when the empire seemed destined to conquer all of Europe and when the Janissaries were the most feared fighting force in the world. Now they were garrison soldiers, maintaining fortifications and suppressing the occasional rebellion, but the glory days were behind them. The younger officers struggled to understand the traditions they had inherited. They had not lived through the great campaigns of the past, had not experienced the intoxicating rush of victory that had sustained earlier generations of To them, the elaborate rituals and ancient customs seemed like meaningless relics of a bygone age. Hazen tried to bridge this gap, to pass on not just the technical knowledge of warfare, but the spirit that had made the Janissaries great. He told them stories of the siege of Vienna, of the retreat through Hungary, of the reforms that had tried to adapt ancient traditions to modern realities. Some listened with respect, others with polite indifference, but all were aware that they were witnessing the end of an era. The final blow came in 1703, when a new rebellion erupted in the Balkans. Serbian and Bulgarian Christians, emboldened by Austrian victories and promises of support, rose against Ottoman rule. The rebellion was led by men who had once been subjects of the empire, some of whom had even served in auxiliary units alongside the Janissaries. Hazen was ordered to suppress the rebellion with his remaining forces. As he led his men through the familiar countryside of his birth, he was struck by the irony of his situation. He had been taken from these hills as a boy, transformed into a Muslim warrior, and now he was returning to fight against people who shared his original faith and heritage. The campaign was brutal and ultimately unsuccessful. The rebels had learned Ottoman tactics and were supported by Austrian weapons and advisors. Hasan's men fought with their traditional courage, but they were outnumbered and The empire's grip on the Balkans was weakening, and no amount of Janissary discipline could reverse the tide of history. During the siege of a small fortress that had once been an Ottoman stronghold, Hazen received word that Sultan Ahmed III had decided to abolish the Devshirme system entirely. Future Janissaries would be recruited only from Muslim Turkish families, ending the tradition that had created warriors like himself. The news hit him like a physical blow, not because he mourned his own past, but because he understood what it meant for the empire's future. In 1706, at the age of 53, Hazen died as he had lived in battle, leading his men against overwhelming odds. A Serbian musket ball found him as he led a final assault on rebel positions, and he fell with the names of Allah and the Sultan on his lips. His men carried his body back to Constantinople, where he was buried with the honors due to a Janissary. The empire would continue for another 2 centuries, but it would never again possess the military instrument that had made it great. The Janissaries would survive as an institution, but they would become increasingly corrupt and ineffective, until they were finally abolished by Sultan Mahmud II in 1820. The last remnants of the system that had created Hazen and thousands like him would die in the flames of their own barracks, victims of a modernization that could no longer accommodate their anachronistic traditions. Thus ended the story of the Janissaries, Christian boys transformed into Muslim warriors, slaves who became the backbone of an empire, and ultimately, relics of a system that could not adapt to the changing world. Their legacy lived on in the institutions they had helped create and the territories they had conquered, but their unique identity as the Sultan's elite soldiers was lost forever to the march of history.